Rather than standing up for international law, we've had ministers coming to this chamber explaining how they plan to break it. The long-term goal to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence sounds, I'm afraid, a little hollow promise. There's no plan and there's no timetable. We welcome this refresh, but we will continue to provide robust scrutiny where necessary to ensure that our country's foreign policy and defence systems are secure for the next generation.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with permission, I will make a statement on the 2023 Integrated Review refresh. 2 years ago, the Government's Integrated Review set out a clear strategy on how the UK would continue to thrive in a far more competitive age. Our approach is the most comprehensive since the end of the Cold War. It laid out how we would bring together the combined might of every part of government to ensure that our country remains safe, prosperous and influential into the 2030s. And the conclusions of that review have run as a golden strategic thread through all of our activities across defence and deterrence, diplomacy, trade and investment, intelligence, security, international development, science and technology over the last 2 years. Our overall analysis was right, and our strategic ambition on track. On every continent of the world, the United Kingdom walks taller today than it has done for many years. We are meeting our obligations as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and as a leading European ally within an expanding NATO. We have strong relationships with our neighbours in Europe, and we will build on the Windsor framework to invigorate them even further. We are deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific, active in Africa, and enjoy thriving relationships with countries in the Middle East and the Gulf. Now, this House, I'm sure, will recall that today is Commonwealth Day, and I'll be meeting my fellow Commonwealth foreign ministers in London over the course of this week. We have maintained our position as a global leader on international development by pursuing patient, long-term partnerships tailored to the needs of our partner countries. And we succeed because those partnerships draw on the full range of UK strengths and expertise in addition to our official development assistance. And as this House will of course be aware, the severe global turbulence forecast in the 21 Integrated Review has indeed come to pass. But the events have moved at an even quicker pace than I think anyone could have imagined just 2 years ago. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and attempts to annex part of its sovereign territory challenge the entire international order. Across the world, state threats have grown and systematic competition has intensified. There is a growing prospect of further deterioration in the coming years. Because of the far-reaching consequences for the security and prosperity of the British people that these changes have brought, it is right that I update the House on what the government is doing to respond. In our 2023 Integrated Review refresh, we set out how we respond to an even more contested and volatile world. Rightly, our approach is an evolution, not a revolution. And I know this House will agree that our most pressing foreign policy priority is the threat that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine poses for European security. The UK has provided huge quantities of military support for Ukraine's defence. We led the G7 response on Ukraine, coordinating diplomatic activity and working with our allies to impose the toughest ever sanctions on Putin's government. And thanks to the wisdom of this government's original Integrated Review, we have intensified our training for thousands of brave Ukrainian troops who repelled Russia's initial onslaught. But this momentum must be maintained until Ukraine prevails and the wider threat that Russia and other states, such as Iran or North Korea, pose to the international order to make sure that their aggression is contained, or potential aggression is contained. The 2023 Integrated Review refresh also sets out how the government will approach the challenges presented by China. China's size and significance connect it to almost every global issue. But we cannot be blind to the increasingly aggressive military and economic behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party, including stoking tensions across the Taiwan Strait and attempts to strong-arm partners, most recently Lithuania. We will increase our national security protections and ensure alignment with both our core allies and a wider set of international partners. And we must build on our own and our allies' resilience to cyber threats, manipulation of information, economic instability and energy shocks, so that we remain at the front of the race for technologies like fusion power that will define not only the next decade, but the rest of this century. Madam Deputy Speaker, my Right Honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will say more on government spending commitments in his spring statement on Wednesday. But today, I can set out a number of both immediate and longer-term measures that will help us deliver on our priorities, and they are as follows. We will increase defence spending by a further £5 billion over the next 2 years. This will bring us to around 2.25% of national income and represents significant progress in meeting our long-term minimum defence spending target of 2.5% of GDP. Today's announcement of £5 billion comes on top of the commitments made by the Chancellor in his autumn budget statement, on top of the £560 million of new investments last year, and on top of the record £20 billion uplift announced in 2020. Later today, the Prime Minister will announce, alongside President Biden and Prime Minister Albanese, the next steps for AUKUS, including how we will deliver multi-billion-pound conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine capabilities to the Royal Australian Navy, whilst setting the highest non-proliferation standards. We will provide an additional £20 million uplift to the BBC World Service over the next 2 years, protecting all 42 World Service language services. We have established a new directorate in the FCDO, incorporating the Government Information Cell, to increase our capacity to assess and counter hostile information manipulation by actors, including Russia and China, where it affects UK interests overseas. We will double funding for Chinese expertise and capacities in government so that we have more Mandarin speakers and China experts. And we will create a new £1 billion integrated security fund to deliver critical programmes at home and overseas on key priorities like economic and cyber security, counter-terrorism, and on the battle to uphold and defend human rights. We will establish a new National Protective Services Authority located within MI5. It will provide UK businesses and other organisations with immediate access to expert security advice. And a new £50 million economic deterrence initiative will strengthen sanctions enforcement and impact, and it will also give us new tools to respond to hostile acts. We will be publishing the UK's first semiconductor strategy, which will grow our domestic industry for this vital technology, as well as an updated critical minerals strategy. The 2023 integrated review reconfirms that the UK will play a leading role in upholding stability, security, and the prosperity of our continent and the Euro-Atlantic as a whole. It underlines that this government's investment in our Indo-Pacific strategy is yielding significant results across defence, diplomacy and trade. Madam Deputy Speaker, through these initiatives and many others we have set out over the past 2 years, the United Kingdom will outcompete those who seek to destabilise the international order and undermine global stability. Our approach is imbued with a spirit of international cooperation and a pragmatic willingness to work with any country that does not seek to undermine our way of life. We will live in a competitive age, and security challenges the British people face today are the most serious in at least a generation. Time and again in our history, we have seen off the competition from countries that wish to do us no good. We were able to do so because the United Kingdom has always had more allies and better allies than any of our rivals or competitors. This will always be the policy of this government to ensure that remains the case, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very good to see you in your place, and can I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Just over a year ago, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine marked a watershed moment for European security. In the time since, 25 NATO countries have revisited their security strategies. Germany announced a fundamental shift in its security policy. Finland and Sweden have taken the historic decision to join NATO. For a year, Labour have urged the government to revisit the integrated review. So this announcement today is overdue, but it's welcome. We are living in an era of intensifying geopolitical competition in a multipolar world. The interdependence of the global economy is increasingly being weaponised, and there's been a blurring of the distinction between foreign and domestic policy. This is a challenging moment for our security and that of our allies and for our place in the world. Madam Deputy Speaker, the refreshed integrated review and the decisions it will inform is therefore important to all of us in this House. We all have an interest in the government making the right long-term choices for our country, and any future Labour government will inherit the consequences of those decisions. Since the invasion, the government have had our fullest support in providing the military, economic and diplomatic support for Ukraine to defend itself. But we've pressed the government where they have fallen short, and it's in that spirit that we approach the review today. The original integrated review contained plenty of analysis that was sound and which could enjoy wide support in this House, but it did have some serious shortcomings. It made no mention of the risks of the Taliban taking over Kabul just months before it happened, nor did it foresee the risks of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine or mention risks related to Taiwan. It had little to say about Europe beyond NATO and said almost nothing about the European Union, which has given one substantive reference in the entire document. In too many areas, from the fight against kleptocracy to the importance of international law, rhetoric and ambition contrasted poorly with government inaction or hypocrisy. Significant and regretful decisions like the decision to cut the ODA spending to 0.5% of GNI and the merger of DFID and the FCDO were taken before the review had even been concluded. And in security and defence, there was a clear mismatch between ends, ways and means. With threats increasing and a promise of persistent global engagement, the government announced plans to cut another 10,000 troops, scrap Hercules planes and drop the 148 Challenger tanks. These are the troops now reinforcing NATO allies, the planes used in the Kabul airlift and the tanks being used and sent to Ukraine. In the 2 years since, in too many areas, the promises of the integrated review have not matched reality. The so-called Indo-Pacific tilt has apparently been completed, but the UK's diplomatic presence in key countries in the region, including India and China, has been cut by up to 50% over the past 8 years. The review promised to maintain the UK as one of the world's leading development actors, but aid has not just been cut from 0.7% to 0.5%, it's now being used to prop up the broken asylum system. And by some estimates, less than half of bilateral development assistance ever leaves the United Kingdom. Rather than standing up for international law, we've had ministers coming to this chamber explaining how they plan to break it. Successive crises, from the pandemic to war in Ukraine, have demonstrated the vulnerability of international supply chains. But we've not seen a new diplomatic drive to reflect the shifting resourcing economy. Britain is falling seriously behind. The United States chips legislation will provide $52 billion in subsidies for US chip manufacturers. The EU Chips Act will provide €43 billion, but the government has put aside just £700,000 to commission a research project. And it still has not published its promised semiconductor strategy. Today, Refresh is therefore an opportunity to address these flaws and reset the government's approach. A test of this integrated review is how it contributes to making Britain secure at home and strong abroad, and this is how we will judge it. The government will continue to have Labour's full support over Ukraine and to reinforce our NATO allies. Labour's commitment to NATO remains unshakable, and our commitment to Britain's independent nuclear deterrence is total. Madam Deputy Speaker, the review's emphasis on building partnerships and alliances is welcome after a period of drift away from multilateralism. Britain is always a stronger and more effective force for good when it works with others. And that's why Labour's foreign policy vision is for a Britain reconnected. And I'm glad the government have been taking notes. Nowhere has the sense of disconnection been stronger than in our post-Brexit relationship with the European Union. It is good that from page 22 to see the government finally acknowledge its importance. Labour would go further and seek a security pact to cooperate on global challenges and keep us safe. On China, we recognise the scale and complexity of the challenge that its rise represents and the breadth of our interests that are at stake. The initiative to improve understanding of China in government is vital, particularly given the Foreign Office has only been training 14 people a year to speak fluent Mandarin. We need a strong, clear-eyed and consistent approach to China, working with partners and allies and engaging with China where our interests align to do so. It feels after years of inconsistent and shifting approaches, this is at least something that we can now welcome. It's good to see a new economic deterrence unit to help enforce sanctions, as mentioned on page 48, because not a single individual or entity has been fined for breaching Russia's sanctions since the invasion, not one. Sanctions without enforcement are useless. And I note the plan for a new Russia strategy, but the government hasn't yet implemented all of the Russia report's recommendations. On Iran, the government is right to recognise the increasing threat. So it was disappointing that they opposed our amendment to create a new mechanism to prescribe hostile state actors like the IRGC. And in an era of disinformation, the BBC World Service is a unique and unparalleled platform, and so the additional funding is very welcome. However, on defence spending, today's announcement provides only funds for AUKUS and Ukraine's replenishment. That is why we welcome it. It does not answer growing questions concerning capability, gaps that weaken our national defence and undermine UK's NATO contribution. The NAO recently said that the MOD cannot afford to develop all the capabilities set out in the 2021 integrated review. How does today's announcement ensure the same doesn't happen now the new 2023 integrated review has been published? The reality is that the government are dragging their feet on the big decisions. The long-term goal to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence sounds, I'm afraid, a little hollow promise. There's no plan and there's no timetable. I can tell him that the last Labour government left office with 2.5% of defence spending intact. The reality is that too much of the government's efforts is focused on undoing its mistakes. The Windsor Framework to fix the protocol they negotiated. A Franco-British summit to repair relations damaged by his predecessor's clumsy diplomacy. A £16.5 billion investment defence swallowed up by a black hole in the budget they mismanaged. Removing the Chinese state role in our nuclear power industry after the government invited them in the first place, and trying to strengthen our leadership in international development after the government squandered it. We welcome this refresh, but we will continue to provide robust scrutiny where necessary to ensure that our country's foreign policy and defence systems are secure for the next generation.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not a religious man, but I understand there is a phrase in the Bible, there is more joy in heaven over a sinner that repents. And it's really good to hear, I say I'm not a religious man, because I am joyful that the Labour front bench has finally, perhaps kicking and screaming, come to the realisation that all the time let's take official development assistance, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government, at its lowest point, is still spending a larger portion of its GDP than at the highest point under the party opposite when they were in government. I remember when the Russian state was instrumental in poisoning British citizens, and the leader of the party opposite at the time was saying we should share our intelligence with the very state that was poisoning British people. I am now glad, finally, to hear a commitment from the Labour front bench about maintaining the nuclear deterrent, about support for NATO. And it's interesting that we are being criticised. It's interesting that we are being criticised for getting our defence spending to 2.25% of GDP, with a commitment to 2.5% of GDP, because I hear no such commitment formally from the shadow defence team on the bench opposite. The simple truth of the matter is that the honourable gentleman has made a number of points about what they would do differently, whilst then saying, but broadly, he agrees with this strategy. And I'm glad that he agrees with this strategy, because we have been working on it for the last. We've been implementing the 2001 integrated review, and we have seen the positive impact it has had on our relations in the Indo-Pacific. The signing of the joint, the FCAS agreement between Italy, Japan and the United Kingdom is testament to that. The fact that the carrier strike group's maiden voyage was into that region is testament to that. And the fact that we are seen absolutely at the forefront of the international support to Ukraine in their self-defence or against Russia's invasion is testament to that. This government will always be an internationally focused government. It will always make sure that we act in close concert with our international partners, and will build greater partners around the world. That's what this refresh is about. It builds on the work of the original integrated review, and I'm very proud that we put it in the public domain, Madam Speaker.